The man had no reason to think the old RV contained anything unusual. He'd bought it after its previous owner died and was simply clearing out whatever had been left behind. Old photographs, utility bills, boxes of forgotten belongings that most people would have thrown away without a second thought. Then he found a stack of handwritten journals. At first the entries seemed strange, ramblings about demons, voices, a bargain with the devil. But a few pages later, the writing changed. The author stopped describing nightmares and started describing something far worse. Not something he'd witnessed, one he'd done. This case wasn't solved by a witness. It was solved by a mistake so small, the killer never realized he'd made it. If you enjoyed true crime documentaries that uncover every clue instead of rushing to the ending, consider subscribing. We upload at least once or twice every week. Stephenville, Texas, July 1987. The call reaching Sergeant Donnie Hensley contained only a few details. A young woman had been found dead inside her home. All available officers were being sent to the scene. Homicides were rare in Stephenville, serious enough that people remembered them for years. As Hensley pulled onto the quiet residential street, police cars already lined the curb, and yellow tape stretched across the front yard. The house didn't look like the scene of a violent attack. The television was still playing. A bag of potato chips rested on the coffee table beside an open can of Coke. A box of snack cakes had been left open. An ashtray nearby held several cigarette butts. One detail immediately stood out. Susan didn't smoke. Detectives paused. If those cigarettes weren't hers, then someone had been sitting here with her. There were no signs of forced entry. Everything suggested Susan had willingly opened the door. At that point, detectives believed they were looking for someone she trusted. That assumption would guide nearly every decision they made over the following months. The bedroom told a different story. The mattress had been shoved halfway off the bed frame. Sheets lay twisted across the floor. Scuff marks cut across the room where furniture had shifted during a struggle. An extension cord rested on the mattress. Thereby sat a pillow marked with dark smears. Mascara. Hensley stared at it for a moment. It appeared someone had forced the pillow against Susan's face while she struggled beneath it. He continued toward the bathroom. Nothing prepared him for what he found there. Susan's body had been left partially submerged in the bathtub. She had been there long enough that investigators couldn't immediately determine exactly how she had died, although evidence strongly suggested she had been sexually assaulted before she was killed. The room fell almost silent as crime scene technicians continued photographing every surface. Then one investigator suddenly called for Hensley. There, against the edge of the bathtub, a clear set of palm prints. The killer had supported their weight for just a moment. One careless mistake. No one inside that bathroom knew those prints would outlive every suspect, every theory, and nearly 20 years of unanswered questions.
Before detectives could understand who might have wanted Susan dead, they first had to understand who she had become in the months leading up to her death. By every account, she wasn't someone who attracted conflict. Friends described her as gentle, soft-spoken, one who listened more than she talked. Life hadn't always been easy, but she believed she was finally turning a corner. Just months earlier, she'd ended a marriage that those closest to her later described as emotionally exhausting. When her husband, Michael Woods, left Texas to Indiana, he didn't simply leave the relationship behind. According to friends and family, he left behind reminders, cruel cassette recordings, handwritten notes hidden throughout the house. Some were tucked inside drawers. Others were hidden in closets and cabinets. Susan would stumble across them days, sometimes weeks after he was gone. Every discovery dragged her back into a chapter she was desperately trying to close. Eventually, she filed a divorce and decided the only way forward was to stay busy. She accepted as many shifts as she could at the local sandpaper factory, hoping to save enough money to replace the car she'd lost after the separation. Work gave her structure. but it couldn't replace companionship. Her closest friend was a woman named Cindy Hallmark. If Susan was quiet, Cindy was the opposite. She had a way of filling a room with conversation and laughter, and she refused to let Susan spend every evening alone. Almost every week, friends and relatives gathered at Cindy's home around her kitchen table. There wasn't an agenda, no club, no membership. People simply showed up. Someone would bring snacks, someone else would put on a pot of coffee. Before long, hours had passed without anyone noticing. The group jokingly called themselves the Round Table. It became Susan's escape. At first, she barely spoke. Most of the people there had known each other for years. She worried she'd always feel like the newcomer. Instead, they welcomed her without hesitation. Little by little, Susan began laughing again. She started sharing stories, making jokes, looking forward to weekends instead of dreading them.
Susan wasn't living in fear anymore. She wasn't wondering whether life would ever get better. She finally believed it already was, and somewhere, without anyone realizing it, someone else had been watching her life move in a very different direction. As officers began interviewing the people closest to Susan, one fact quickly became impossible to ignore. Almost everyone described her as cautious, especially after the divorce. She'd become so uneasy about someone entering her home that she'd asked Roy Hayes to nail several of her windows shut from the inside. It wasn't because anyone had tried to break in. She simply wanted to feel safe. That detail made detectives pause. If Susan had gone to such lengths to protect herself, why was the front door unlocked? Why were there signs she'd calmly shared a drink and snacks with someone? Those two facts didn't seem to belong together, unless the person standing at her door that Sunday evening wasn't a stranger at all. They were someone she recognized, someone she believed had no reason to hurt her. That realization quietly narrowed the investigation. Instead of asking who could have entered Susan's home, detectives began asking who she would have invited inside, and one by one, the names started to emerge. The first few interviews didn't point detectives toward a single suspect. They pointed in several different directions. On paper, each one made sense. An ex-husband with a troubled past, a former boyfriend whose relationship with Susan had only ended weeks earlier, close friends who had spent time inside her home. At that stage, investigators weren't trying to prove anyone was guilty. They were trying to eliminate people one by one. The sooner they could cross a name off the list, the closer they believed they were getting to the truth. The problem was, none of those names stayed crossed off for very long. Michael Woods was the obvious place to begin. Divorces often leave behind anger, resentment, and unfinished business. Detectives couldn't ignore the history between Michael and Susan. By the time Susan was killed, Michael had already moved to Indianapolis. He insisted he hadn't been anywhere near Texas. More importantly, he claimed he had an alibi. Not just one witness, several. The explanation sounded convincing enough that the original investigators accepted it without much resistance. At the time, that seemed reasonable. People naturally gravitate towards explanations that neatly fit the evidence they have. If Michael was hundreds of miles away, detectives could focus their attention elsewhere. For the moment, they did exactly that. The next conversation was with Susan's former boyfriend, J.C. Bauman. Unlike Michael, J.C.'s relationship with Susan hadn't ended in bitterness. Friends described the breakup as respectful. There didn't appear to be any lingering hostility between them. Still, detectives couldn't ignore one uncomfortable coincidence. The smoker who'd sat in Susan's living room had apparently been drinking Coke. J.C. smoked. He also drank Coke regularly. It wasn't evidence, but it's simply another detail that refused to disappear. When investigators asked where he'd been on the night Susan was believed to have been killed, J.C. couldn't provide much of an alibi. He'd spent the evening alone. No witnesses. Nothing that could firmly place him anywhere. That immediately kept his name near the top of the list. Then the interview took an unexpected turn. Detectives asked about the nature of his relationship with Susan. JC admitted they had been intimate once. He even told them where: her bathtub. The room suddenly grew quiet. Investigators exchanged brief glances. That wasn't information they had asked for, and it immediately raised another possibility. Had JC volunteered that detail because he genuinely wanted to be honest, or because he feared his fingerprints might already be waiting for detectives inside the bathroom? It wasn't an accusation, it was simply the kind of question investigators are trained to ask themselves. People sometimes reveal information for reasons they don't even realize. Sergeant Hensley decided to take a chance. Legally, he couldn't force JC to provide fingerprints without charging him, but nothing prevented him from asking. To Hensley's surprise, JC agreed almost immediately. He even told detectives that if his fingerprints helped solve Susan's murder, they could have whatever they needed. The response caught Hensley off guard. Minutes earlier, JC had seemed increasingly suspicious. Now, he appeared relieved. Hensley sent JC's fingerprints to the state crime lab, knowing he might be waiting months for an answer. Rather than sit idle, he moved on to his next interview. Roy Hayes walked into the police station the following afternoon. He wasn't just Cindy Hallmark's boyfriend, he'd also become one of Susan's closest friends. Roy's interview ended without the breakthrough Hensley had hoped for. Like JC, he agreed to provide his fingerprints without putting up a fight. If he was worried about what investigators might find, he certainly didn't show it. By the time Roy walked out of the station, Hensley found himself in a frustrating position. The interview had produced more questions than answers. Roy's eagerness to discuss the crime felt unusual. His detailed knowledge of the house felt unusual. But suspicion isn't evidence, and Hensley knew better than to mistake instinct for proof. So Roy's fingerprints joined JC's, heading to the state crime lab. Then the investigation took an unexpected turn, not because of something detectives discovered, but because of something they should have checked months ago.
Michael had always insisted he was in Indianapolis with several people on the night Susan was killed. Previous investigators had accepted that explanation and shifted their attention elsewhere. But accepted wasn't the same as confirmed. Hensley contacted police in Indianapolis and asked them to help verify every part of Michael's story. Several days later, the phone rang. The answer wasn't what he expected. According to the officer on the other end, Michael had indeed promised to provide names of the people who could confirm his whereabouts. He never did. The alibi detectives had relied upon for months had never actually been investigated. For Hensley, the realization was impossible to ignore. The case hadn't hit a dead end because there were no leads. It had hit one because an important question had gone unanswered. A few weeks later, Hensley boarded a flight to Indianapolis. He wasn't traveling there to arrest Michael. He didn't have enough evidence for that. What he wanted was an opportunity. If Michael committed even a minor offense in front of local officers, Hensley could potentially obtain his fingerprints through a lawful arrest. It wasn't glamorous detective work, it was patience. For several days, Hensley sat inside an unmarked vehicle, watching the small house where Michael lived with roommates. Morning turned into afternoon. Afternoon became evening. Nothing happened. Michael left occasionally, bought groceries, returned home. His roommates seemed just as ordinary. The longer the surveillance continued, the more Hensley wondered whether he'd flown halfway across the country, chasing the wrong man. Then, one Saturday morning, the front yard suddenly filled with furniture, boxes, clothing, household decorations. The roommates were setting up a yard sale. Hensley raised his camera and began photographing everything they carried outside. Not because yard sales are suspicious, because investigators learn to notice details other people overlook. One object immediately caught his attention, then another. Crystal figurines, small decorative pieces sitting on a folding table in the front yard. According to Susan's family, similar figurines had disappeared when Michael left Texas after the divorce. Were these the same ones?
Hensley couldn't say for certain, but they looked close enough to ask another question. If they belonged to Susan, then Michael might be selling stolen property, and suddenly the detective had exactly the opportunity he'd been waiting for. Local officers arrived shortly afterwards. The yard sale came to an abrupt stop. Michael was taken into custody on suspicion of possessing stolen property. For Hensley, the arrest wasn't the end of the trip, it was the beginning. Finally, he had Michael's fingerprints. As he boarded the flight back to Texas, he couldn't help thinking about the three men whose prints were now making their way through the crime lab. Michael, JC, Roy. One of them seemed almost certain to provide the answer. It felt less like a mystery now, and more like a countdown.
Weeks later, a large envelope arrived at the Stephenville Police Department. The return address belonged to the state crime lab. Months of interviews, travel, surveillance, waiting. Everything seemed to lead to this moment. He reached for the first report. No match. He picked up the second. No match. The third. No match. Hensley read the reports again, then a third time. Nothing had changed. The palm prints recovered from Susan's bathtub belonged to no one. Not Michael, not JC, not Roy. For a long moment, the room was silent. The evidence hadn't just eliminated 3 suspects, it had erased the entire direction of the investigation. The one clue detectives believed would finally solve Susan's murder had only deepened the mystery. Hensley had exhausted nearly every promising lead. There were no more obvious suspects waiting to be interviewed, no new witnesses stepping forward, no fresh forensic evidence, only a pair of unidentified palm prints quietly waiting inside an evidence box. And before long, so was the case itself. 19 years passed. The case slowly became something people mentioned only when talking about the town's history. Inside the Stephenville Police Department, Susan's file sat exactly where cold cases often do, on a shelf, waiting for someone with enough time and enough curiosity to open it again. In early 2006, Lieutenant Don Miller was assigned to review several unsolved murders. Susan's case was one of them. He wasn't expecting a breakthrough. He simply wanted to see if anything had been overlooked. For days, Miller worked through the file. Crime scene photographs, interview transcripts, evidence logs, Sergeant Hensley's handwritten notes. The more he read, the more respect he developed for the original investigation. Hensley hadn't ignored the evidence. He'd chased it relentlessly. The problem was, the technology simply hadn't existed to answer the questions he was asking.
One piece of evidence kept drawing Miller's attention: the palm prints. They had survived 19 years. They had survived changing detectives. They had survived every suspect being ruled out, and they still belonged to no one. Back in 1987, that had been the end of the road. Fingerprint comparisons depended on having someone to compare them against. But nearly 2 decades later, policing had changed. The FBI now maintained a national fingerprint database containing millions of prints collected from arrests across the United States. For the first time, detectives no longer needed a suspect, they only needed a fingerprint. Miller realized he didn't have the budget to reopen the entire investigation, but he didn't need one. Submitting the prints would take only a few minutes, so he sent them to the FBI. Only a few days later, Miller's phone rang. The FBI had found a match. For a brief moment, he wondered which familiar name he was about to hear: Michael, JC, Roy. Instead, the agent gave him a name Miller barely recognized: Scott Hatley. Miller frowned. He searched his memory. Nothing. The name meant almost nothing to him. Even stranger, Scott hadn't been arrested in Texas. His fingerprints were in the database because of a robbery case in Nevada. At first glance, it seemed impossible that he could be connected to Susan Woods, so Miller pulled Susan's file back onto his desk. He flipped through every interview, every witness statement, every list of friends, and then he found the name. Not as a suspect, not even as a person of interest, just another familiar face among the people who surrounded Susan during the final months of her life. Scott Hatley, Cindy Hallmark's younger cousin, a regular member of the Round Table, someone investigators had never seriously considered.
The realization was difficult to accept. Scott hadn't forced his way into Susan's life. He'd already been part of it. He'd laughed with the same group of friends, spent evenings around the same kitchen table, attended the same gatherings. He had even been present at Susan's funeral, comforting the very people grieving the woman he had killed. It explained something detectives had struggled with from the beginning. Susan hadn't opened her door to a stranger. She'd opened it to someone she knew, someone she believed was safe. As investigators rebuilt Scott's movements, a heartbreaking picture emerged. Just 1 week before Susan's death, he had joined another Round Table gathering. Susan was there too. Friends remembered she seemed happier than she'd been in months. At one point during the evening, she looked towards Scott and smiled. To everyone else, it was an ordinary moment, a simple gesture between friends. Investigators later concluded Scott interpreted it very differently. He convinced himself the smile meant something more. Days later, carrying a mixture of alcohol, soda, and cough syrup, he drove to Susan's home. When she answered the door, she recognized him. She invited him inside. They talked. She brought him a Coke and something to eat. For a little while, nothing seemed unusual. Then Scott tried to kiss her. Susan immediately pulled away. She rejected him. According to investigators, that rejection triggered a sudden explosion of violence. Susan fought back. She even struck him across the face, but she couldn't stop the attack. During the struggle, Scott braced himself against the bathtub, his palms pressed firmly against the edge, for only a second, long enough to leave behind the evidence that would eventually identify him. He walked out of the house, believing he'd gotten away with murder. In one sense, he had, for almost 20 years. On June 7, 2006, officers arrested Scott Hatley and charged him with Susan's murder. Faced with the evidence against him, he eventually accepted a plea agreement. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison. In the end, he served just over 11 before being released for good behavior. Years later, Scott died from complications related to cancer. After his death, investigators searching through his belongings found the journals that had first drawn attention inside that old RV. Among pages describing demons, Satan, and what Scott believed were dark forces influencing his life, he admitted killing Susan. He claimed something outside himself had driven him to commit the crime. Investigators saw it differently. Nothing in those pages changed the evidence, but the diary only confirmed what science had quietly proven years earlier. Susan Woods spent the final months of her life believing she'd finally escaped the darkest chapter she'd ever known, started imagining a future that finally felt hopeful. But it was taken by someone she trusted and welcomed into her home. Until next time, stay curious and take care.